Is Russia, China, and Iran using social media and other tactics to thwart our elections and undermine our democracy? Are some of our very own leaders intentionally driving us to new levels of hate and violence for their self-interest? Is COVID-19 going to be used as a political ploy to dictate our pursuits as evolving, healthy communities? As a result of these things, and much more like extreme bias, are we on the verge of a civil war? If so, between who? Realistic conflict theory. Is it us versus them, or us versus us? We have big problems that need solving right now. How do we fix this? Can we fix this? And just what exactly is the fixing that's needed? It looks like one problem to one group and another problem to another group, right? Well, can we trust those who say they'll fix it for us? Big claims require big research. This is the new reach. I'm on a mission to learn, test myself, and to find answers we can all use. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a model known by social and psychological studies as realistic conflict theory is taking us to certain ruin if we don't learn how to stop it. Why is it so important that you know about this model? What can I do? What can you do? What is its connection to solving these huge problems? Right now, abuses of power, divisions on how to manage a health crisis, political and racial separatism, violence, murder, and even a lack of basic respect for other persons, property, and human rights are the results of this. It's an us versus them and an us versus us model of realistic conflict theory we found ourselves in. What many don't know is we have a very clear grassroots answer. To apply the answer, we must first be wiser and more aware of our failures and how our biases contribute to our weaknesses. And second, how others will and are using them against us. One of the very things that has been proven in studies to solve these specific types of conflict problems, we're told to not do it. Even worse, if we do, we face fine, penalty, or prison, or a ton of shame at minimum. I've been on a mission for a few years now to learn my part in making our coexistence here a better one. As part of that mission, I'm working to meet, interview, and learn from others in conflicts around these very issues. One of my efforts in doing this took me to Utah to meet with two groups and their leaders. They found themselves in direct conflict in the streets of Salt Lake City suburbs, in news outlets, and on social media. Of the many things we discussed, both speak about how civil war appears to be a possible future event. John Sullivan, a Black Lives Matter movement leader of a group called Insurgents USA and Black Fist Coalition.
We got rip Trump out of that office right over there, pull him out that Nah, we ain't about waiting until the next election. We about to go get that motherfucker. I ain't about that because you know what time it is? I want y'all to be after me. It's time for a revolution. It's time.
Yep, that's what's gonna happen very shortly. That's why I think there's a civil war that's coming, and it's terrible. It's terrible. And, you know, resolution peacefully would be great. And I hope that happens. But the escalation of tensions, of people getting shot from either side, from things that are not being resolved at all or addressed, it's gonna happen.
Do you think, though, that the more we become aware that we are the ones being played, that can be avoided? And Casey Roberts, the patriotic leader of a group called Utah Citizens Law.
After weeks of protests, the clash of rights came to a head in Provo at the beginning of July.
The violence is now here. So it's in my town now.
What happened in Casey Robertson's hometown urged him to put out the call.
And so I got on Facebook and I said, who wants to come down there with me and show them that we're not going to put up with violence in our town?
So now we're perfectly staged for a civil war, right? We got bad guys and the good guys, and everyone thinks they're the good guy. But like, I've been trying to think this, what's the point? Why? And obviously the election is coming up in November. There definitely could be some, hey, if we do this, people are gonna vote this way. You know, if we make Trump look like an asshole, people are gonna vote liberal, or vote for Biden, whatever, or vice versa. But what's going to be who's going to gain from this civil war?
Whether it is from nefarious actors working a plan through us or just our innate human shortcomings, the answer is still the answer. Once you know the answer, you have the power to help change it and bring us into a better future for all of us. Before you get the answer, you need to better understand how realistic conflict theory models work through in-group and out-group biases. How powerfully realistic conflict theory can be used against us to incite division and conflict depends on how far we polarize into one group versus another group. So what most of us tend to do is find ways to confirm our biases as being right, so we protect that feeling of being right and stay aligned with those in that group. As we all know, group peer pressures can stop us from possibly acting on better options for us all. We think things like, the people in the other groups are just not as smart as me, or they obviously have some character flaws that are detrimental to seeing my worldview. We need to realize this polarization for what it is, societal sabotage. Realistic conflict theory takes the worst of these perspectives and makes them even bigger and more deeply ingrained. Now, forming in-groups and out-groups is a very natural thing that we do. It can provide a good value in our connections with others in many ways. But take just enough of the negative tendencies we have in why and how we form in-group coalitions and how we tend to look at out-groups as enemies. It doesn't take much to get someone in there that knows how to stir the pot and magnify those potentially terrible results. As in the Robber's Cave experiment, Sharif and his team did just that, intentionally stirred the pot to help fabricate and raise conflict between the two groups. There is something inside many of us that identifies there are outside agents exploiting our weaknesses in our in-group bias. They work to increase points of conflict rather than direct us to points of superordinate goals that we should work towards together. Realistic conflict theory, the Robber's Cave experiment. In the 1950s, a social psychologist, Muzaffar Sharif, and his colleagues selected 11 to 12-year-old boys, divided them into two groups. At first, each group of the boys thought theirs was the only group at the camp facility. Sharif and his colleagues posed as the camp counselors. The boys didn't know they were taking part in an intergroup study of conflict and resolution of conflict. Phase 1 of the study was in-group formation. Each group spent time forming social norms, leadership, and group structure. They were given 5 to 6 days to bond and form their group's identity. One group called themselves the Rattlers, the other group called themselves the Eagles. Each group made a flag to represent their group and spent time bonding with their own in-group through activities like treasure hunts and swimming and hiking. Phase 2 of the study was group conflict. Sharif began to expose the two groups to each other. Once the two groups realized they were having to share resources, time and space in the facilities, they wanted to challenge the other to formal sporting competitions to prove who the more competent group is. Their own, of course. Sharif set up where there would be clear winners and losers. The winning group receives prizes, the losing group gets nothing. This was one of the many ways Sharif and his colleagues inserted conflict over resources. Keep in mind, resources can represent something tangible, in this case, food, prizes, or say independent access to the baseball field. And as non-tangible resources like equality, liberty, and values that form group identities and social norms. Sharif also intentionally created situations where one group clearly gained at the expense of the other. For example, one group was delayed getting to a picnic, and when they arrived, they discovered the other group had eaten their food. This helped drive prejudice and conflict between the groups. It was first only expressed verbally by taunting and name-calling. As competitions continued, each group's prejudice and conflict became physical. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers ransacked the Eagles' cabin, overturned beds, and stole private property. The groups became so aggressive with each other that some boys got into fistfights, and researchers had to physically separate them. They gave the groups a few days to cool off before beginning the final phase. Phase 3, contact hypothesis or conflict resolution. Sharif and his team brought the boys back together for events that might help them reduce their animosity for one another. He wanted to provide them opportunity for reconciliation. He contrived contact events like coming together for 4th of July and watching a film. He realized these types of contrived contact events alone weren't enough to resolve this level of conflict between the groups. Superordinate goals were introduced. Superordinate goals are goals that get people from opposing sides to come together and work toward a common end result. To introduce superordinate goals for the two groups, Sharif and his team intentionally stopped the camp's water supply, which was located on the hill above the camp. Sharif told the boys it was broken by vandals and they needed help find it and fix it. Both groups collectively found the blockage in the water flow and worked together to learn how to fix it. The Rattlers didn't even object to having the Eagles get ahead of them to be the first to get a drink. Rather, they all celebrated accomplishing a superordinate goal together. Another superordinate goal Sharif's team introduced was the camp's food supply truck was stuck in a low trench. The groups had to come together to use the tug-of-war rope to pull the truck out. Sharif reports that before conflict hypothesis with superordinate goals were engaged in, the two groups came together for meals. They sat in clearly defined separations from the other. After contact hypothesis and superordinate goals were introduced at breakfast and lunch on the last day, the boys' seating was considerably mixed, where no longer clear intergroup and outer group were visible. Here's the kicker. The Robbers Cave experiment we just talked about was the third of 3 similar experiments Sharif conducted with boys at camp around realistic conflict theory and conflict resolution. An earlier study conducted by Sharif and his team produced a very different result. While the researchers were in the process of trying to incite hostilities between the groups, the campers figured out what the researchers were trying to do. Both of the two boys' groups realized they were being manipulated and responded and no longer seeing their groups as the in-group and out-group. But they saw the team of counselors and Sharif as being the out-group, the actual threat and source of conflict. I believe that's part of our answer. I promised you solutions, or at least tools, in how we can reduce many of these conflicts and the sabotage we're in. Take action with me. Stop complaining about symptoms and start dealing with what's magnifying the cause. Willingness. Be willing to acknowledge that we have biases that may not serve us in our collective humanity any further. I know you'll say, but my ideas of humanity are the right ones and the others groups are bad. Maybe, but that's part of step 2. Right now, just be willing to look at what's feeding your biases and challenge the message and its messenger. For example, check the message and the messenger in our media programs. The information may or may not be fully or even partially correct, but the framing of the bias in the message, how it's being applied, or what the next action it might demand of you should be carefully considered. The framing bias of our media programs are being spewed at us at every second of the day. Yes, I call them programs because that's exactly what they are. Programs planned and created to program our perspectives, our views, and our actions. Part of being willing to acknowledge our biases includes this. Realize how our judgments are influenced by what springs most easily to mind. What's most available to us is what they want us to have. The barrage of biased media programming, it's an availability heuristic. You see, availability heuristic is how our judgments to think and act are motivated by how recent and emotionally powerful our most available memories are. The more emotionally powerful and recent, the more relevant and valid they seem. The more frequently we subject ourselves to them, the more they have us where they want us. What's being made most available to us through our media are framed biases and terribly unhealthy levels of prejudice, hate, deceit, and rash judgments. And what do? We keep going back to it because it's right there. Number 2 is awareness. Be aware how aggravators work to keep us in conflict through our in-group and out-group biases. Think, are you contributing to it? If so, how? One of the easiest ways to manipulate you is through what's called your confirmation bias. It's arguably one of the easiest things for them to exploit us through, and possibly the toughest one for us to get rid of. Remember I said how we want to feel right and avoid the discomfort of being wrong? Confirmation bias is how we build delusions that confirm the way we already think. It's our frail ego trying to preserve its false sense of self, no matter the cost. We can take this manipulative tool away from them by removing ourselves from watching so many of our preferred news outlets and stop clicking on the social media feeds that agree with them. Just stop. You don't even have to introduce new outlets or feeds that don't agree with you at this point. Just stop someone else's voice and their interpretations of the world and ideas from directing yours for now. Continuing to subject ourselves to their programming is continuing to allow them to manipulate and force their tactics to keep us divided. They constitute a third group, and one that is arguably the most powerful of the three, and that they in fact become the outgroup. I say we hold the power to not allow them to manipulate and delude us by not subjecting to their tactics of inciting conflict, where conflict is not what we need or want. Be aware of the obvious, that there are immeasurable number of in-groups and out-groups that make up our society. Life is far more diverse and creative and ever evolving than simply left side, right side, blue, red, Democrat, Republican, black, white, rich, poor. You get the point. Be aware the aggravators put immense pressure for us to line under a single designator that they've given us to choose from. Part of our aggravators message, one that you may yourself very well be spreading today, is that if you're party to one, then you're enemy to another. Working us to stay divided by only two variables is a facade. This is clear evidence of a realistic conflict theory being played out and how contact hypothesis contributes to our answer. Contact hypothesis, also known as intergroup contact, a term describing how conflicts between in-groups and out-groups are resolved by spending quality time as mixed groups working toward common goals. It has been studied hundreds of times for decades between incredibly diverse groups, topics, and types of contact, and the results are consistent. That contact generally reduces intergroup prejudice and improves intergroup relations. Evidence shows that if you want two groups to get along, get them to spend time together. This is where we see the mandates around COVID-19 threatening our ability to do this by stopping us from spending quality time with others outside our in-groups. We're spending more time separated from each other in person, where real exposure to real people of all groups, where quality dialogues can take place. Instead, we're spending much more time online and living through their media tools, subjecting us to even more of their framing bias and availability heuristic to keep us feeding our intergroup bias. Remember when, before we were restricted from spending time out in public, where we naturally had shared time with mixed groups, meeting new people, being introduced to new thoughts and perspectives, talking in public places about mutual values? We're not allowed to come together in groups to perform our ability to resolve these issues ourselves in the many proven ways we can. Is this a study in keep people apart so they call for us to resolve this problem? When it may be that some don't want these problems resolved since they benefit from this division and their control over us and how we are allowed to manage it. They've told us, no, you can't do that. Go back indoors, fear all of those outside your group, stay mad at them, stay angry and woke about the issues we tell you to stay emotionally inflamed about. It seems they want us to see others in public, not as our fellow humans, but as outgroups with little in common and as walking deadly virus bags that threaten each other's lives just by being out and about. There has been such a strong deterrent in the mandates that we're being told that if we do spend time together, unless it's for required, absolutely essential resources or gathering in protests or actions that support one of the intergroup biases they want to enforce us at healthy levels to have, then we're shamed or fined or arrested. Even online, if we don't toe the line they say should be towed, we're deplatformed. Our voices removed from their online echo chambers. So how do we make contact hypothesis or intergroup contact work for us under these conditions? If you can, share in activities and space with others where groups are likely mixed in small numbers. Take action, get out there and do it. Be patient and be kind though. Be mindful not to have a goal of pushing your personal ideologies around at others. Just be with others, see that they are deserving of respect, even if their thoughts are far from your own. Learn, listen, and respect. Yeah, we get irritated by being around others who want to always talk about how their group is awesome and that others are just stupid or racist or don't even have a clue. People who build their thoughts of others around large stereotypes are not helping anyone. This makes the initial attempts of coming together to work in intergroup conflict tough at first. But remember, the more we come together to listen and have positive dialogues, the less those stereotypes hold up. After all, there are far more positive values that we hold similar to one another than there are those that we do not. Number 4, superordinate goals. Identify what higher goals benefit all groups and find someone outside of your group to work with them together. Find groups or coalitions set out to serve communities' needs. While there, avoid feeding conversations that place blame for the problems you're working on at others due to bias and stereotypes. Just concentrate on working with the person present and enjoy the benefits your collective works are doing. I found that when I'm working with others in common cause activities, say feed the homeless or clean up parks and beaches, just a small example, I found myself side by side with people of all political affiliations, races, and ideologies. If you're hearing that one group owns these type of actions over another one, I just haven't seen it. All types of people from all types of groups join together for common goals. Well, you may say, that's what we're trying to do now in our current protests and activism. We're working on superordinate goals, common goals of equality, justice, and reform. These are for all humanity and far more important at the moment than a clean park, for example. Of course, my point with these examples of smaller goals is that they bring us together over less currently tense issues, where we can be exposed to intergroup contact at positive levels. Doing so, we can better learn how to overcome these stereotypes and biases through respect and to work together more effectively. So yes, interest to pursue change around human rights, liberty, equality, safe communities, friendly borders, the list goes on, are all superordinate goals that we should be working at together. The problem is that our points of contact and interactions, the way we're promoted to engage in these real issues, have been strategically categorized and framed up. We're told that one group owns some of these issues and the other group owns others. Check the message and the messenger. Some of the leaders who say they'll fix it for us are benefiting from our being in it. They're not interested in truly fixing it. To protect their special interests, the options they try to give us looks like this. If you want these issues fixed, enter through the appropriate door and flip off those entering that other door because they're your enemy. That is a facade, an illusion, and a ploy we're being played and manipulated through. Imagine it this way. The cause for our current protests are valid humanitarian interests. But if this were, say, a football game we're in, the coaches have created a terrible set of unrealistic rules and penalties. It's a hijacked game they're trying to make us play on their field in their terms. We, the players, need to call forfeit and start a new game with our abilities in positive, proven rules, or models, if you will, that supports a fair outcome for intergroup contact. Rules that actually bring usable rewards and results. Clearly, the ways we're engaged in these conflicts right now is dividing us more and more. It's not because we're not all upset about the actions of a few bad actors harming others in our society, because we are. Or that we're not mad about those who idly stand by and watch it happen, because we are. But rather because the way in which it's being managed is a manipulated, realistic conflict theory, intentionally using in-group and out-group bias to keep us acting out our most negative sides, while provocateurs and aggravators, political leaders, media corporations benefit from our division, anger, and fear. They are the out-group in the experiment we are currently in. May I suggest a number of other superordinate goals that need serious attention? Immediate needs that do not divide us by race, religion, partisanship, gender, or other possibly tense biases. How about we work towards reducing the number of suicides that are happening every day because of physical and emotional isolations and social breakdowns due to the coronavirus shutdown? How about human trafficking of all kinds? Every day, innocent men, women, and children are being taken to the most horrific conditions and scenarios most of us would never allow our minds to even imagine. How about how we are tearing down the livability of our own earth, our home, the only one we have? I don't care what side of climate change you're on. That's not what I'm talking about. Our home should never be a partisan-based topic, ever. I'd like to see a real-world test take place. Stop clicking on what they're putting in front of us and keeping us engaged in their game. What would happen if an overwhelming majority of us move over to another superordinate goal? Would they start addressing that with as much energy instead? Would they consider that if they really want to serve the interests of the people, they would follow our lead? Maybe in an effort to keep our attention so that they might prove real value to us, where we no longer give them power to control us with fear, hate, and negative tactics. Otherwise, we might just realize they're the most threatening group. Earlier, I asked the question, Can we trust those who say they'll fix it for us? Our leaders in office have a responsibility to aid us in our pursuits of superordinate goals that emphasize what brings us together. Yes, I believe some are, yet with some it seems they've learned how to take advantage of our interest for doing good and acting humanely and turn them just enough to work for their special interests, all the while making us think they are working on our interests. Again, the tactic is called framing bias. They've used it to pass bills that look like they're working with us just enough, but affords them a bigger gain in the meantime. Our journalists and news outlets have a responsibility to stop driving single-sided narratives that deepen bias and prejudice against us as collective humanity. I challenge our media outlets and journalists to not just seek to outrage its audience to incite bias and clicks, because we've seen that hate gets clicks, but put human interest above SEO positions and ad dollars. When you publish articles and videos, work on reducing bias. I challenge you to present a solution that goes beyond a partisan preference-only solution. Reach higher. Reach for something more valuable than that easy access you've commonly found and not gotten us anywhere in the current conflicts with. Reach higher than the bottom shelf for solutions. We must direct our efforts to work together, beyond biases and the facade that there are only two groups, only two facades to define our nation of diversity and complex humanitarian interests. In the earlier result of the Robbers Cave experiment, the two groups of kids realized their success was less connected to the us versus us model that they may have first had. My group versus your group in the us versus us model. It proved to be an us two groups versus them, the third and most truly manipulative group, that they had to manage their path to success around. The act of not playing into the conflicts incited by the them group removed the power the them group had to manipulate the two us groups. As a result, these two us groups increased their likelihood to come together to accomplish anything they set out to accomplish. We can resolve our issues by recognizing what's feeding our bias, laying down our differences for a while and choosing to work together. Being aware that outside aggravators, inside and outside our fences, will try to keep us from success. Learn what those tactics look like. Don't fall prey to hate, division, and incited conflicts. It's part of our natural human behavior to coalesce with like kinds and like minds. That may be to simply enjoy the feeling of safety and security that comes from being part of a community. We must remain aware that while doing this, we are also creating a separatism from those unlike in kind or mind. But how far, how much, and with what bias, if any, and to what end? Should we blame ourselves for what seems to be growing more and more out of control? The short answer is yes and no. Yes, in that awareness is ours to be had and to act on in light of understanding. No, in that just like in the Robbers Cave study, the campers were given manipulated conditions by their leaders. Conditions that drove their behaviors to divide and fight against rather than coalesce to work together for higher common goals. Human, friend, relative, neighbor, or as in the Robbers Cave study, camp participant, are all true statements of every one of us. Thank you.